Esther was only 24, yet her life had already been shaped by hardship. She lived in a small, run-down room, tucked away behind a modest food stall that sat under the shade of a large tree in Lagos. The wooden planks that made up her stall were weathered, held together by the stubborn hope of her small dreams. The iron sheets that formed its roof barely kept out the heat of the sun, but it was all she had. Every morning, Esther woke before the sun and started her work. She cooked rice, beans, and yam porridge, serving it to the passers-by who came for a quick bite, barely making enough to keep the stall running. Yet, despite everything, she always had a smile on her face. Her slippers were worn, her dress patched up in places, but her spirit remained unbroken. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She had no family to speak of. Her parents had passed away when she was very young, and since then she had learned to fend for herself. Life wasn't easy, and every day was a struggle, but she never allowed herself to wallow in despair. "Good afternoon, sir. You're welcome." She would greet every customer with a smile no matter how tired she was. People from all walks of life came to Esther's stall, some with their own burdens, and many with barely enough to pay for the meal she served. But Esther was kind, and she would never turn anyone away without food. She understood what it was like to be hungry, to go without, and to survive on what little you had. That was the way of the world for Esther, and she had made peace with it. One afternoon, as she wiped down the counter of her stall, a familiar voice called out to her. "Why are you always smiling when you are struggling just like every one of us?" It was Mama Titi, an older woman who sold vegetables by the street corner. Esther looked up and gave her a soft smile. "Because crying will not bring food to my pot," she replied, her voice filled with quiet resolve. Mama Titi laughed and walked away, but her words lingered in Esther's mind. It was true, Esther had nothing, yet she always gave whatever she could to those in need. She didn't know it then, but that very kindness would soon change the course of her life. Every day, without fail, a crippled beggar would appear at her stall. He would come from the corner of the street, slowly pushing his old creaky wheelchair with his hands. The sound of the wheels scraping against the stones, creak, 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 was a familiar, albeit sad, tune that played each afternoon. People would often laugh or turn their noses up, disgusted by the sight of him. He was a broken man, his legs wrapped in old bandages, his knickers torn at the knees, his face dark with the dust of the streets. His eyes always seemed tired, as though life had drained him of all hope. Some people claimed he smelled, others said he was mad, but Esther never once looked away. She always called him Papa J, though he never asked for food or charity. He never stretched out his hands, nor did he call out to anyone. He just sat there, quietly, in his wheelchair. One afternoon, the sun beat down relentlessly from above as Papa J made his usual appearance. Esther glanced up from her work and saw him stop near her stall. His legs were still wrapped in bandages, and his clothes were in tatters, but Esther smiled and called out to him, "You're here again, Papa J. You didn't eat yesterday." Papa J's voice was quiet, almost a whisper, as he looked down at his hands. "I was too weak to come," he said softly. "I have not eaten in 2 days." Esther's heart went out to him. She looked at the small plate of beans and yam she had left on her table, the only food she had planned to eat herself. She hesitated for a moment, then, without saying a word, she took the plate and placed it in front of him. "Here, eat," she said gently. Papa J's eyes widened in surprise. "You're giving me your last plate again?" he asked, his voice full of disbelief. Esther nodded, her eyes soft. "I can cook again when I get home," she said, the words simple but filled with sincerity. He looked down at the food, then back at her, his hands shaking as he reached for the spoon. His eyes shimmered with unshed tears, though he did not cry. He simply bowed his head and began to eat slowly, his hands trembling. People passing by stared, some whispering, others shaking their heads in disdain. "Esther, why do you always feed that beggar?" a woman asked, her voice laced with judgment. Esther looked up, smiling softly. "If I was the one sitting there in a wheelchair, wouldn't I want someone to help me too?" she replied calmly. From that day onward, Papa G appeared every afternoon. He never asked for anything, never begged. He would sit silently in his wheelchair by the side of her stall, resting his tired hands on his legs, his head bowed in quiet humility. Esther continued to serve him food, each day offering whatever she had. Sometimes it was rice, other times beans and yam. She always gave it with a smile, never expecting anything in return. It was the middle of the afternoon, and Esther had just finished serving some schoolboys when she looked up and saw Papa J again, sitting in his usual spot. His clothes were more ragged than usual, and his wheelchair seemed even more fragile. But still, he sat there, as he always did, silent and patient. Esther walked over to him, a plate of fresh jollof rice in her hands. "Papa J," she said gently, "your food is ready." Papa J looked up at her, his tired eyes softening when they met hers. "You always remember me," he said quietly, his voice filled with gratitude. Esther knelt down and placed the food gently beside him. "Even if the whole world forgets you," she said, her voice firm, "I won't." Just then, a large black car drove up and stopped right in front of her stall. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He was dressed in a crisp white shirt and dark trousers, his shoes polished to a gleaming shine. He was tall, with deep, thoughtful eyes. Esther stood up quickly, brushing her hands on her apron. "Good afternoon, sir," she greeted him politely. The man nodded, but his gaze was fixed on Papa J, who was still eating his meal. Esther noticed something strange. Papa J had stopped chewing, his fork suspended mid-air. The man took a step closer, his expression one of deep recognition. He tilted his head slightly, as though trying to remember something. Then, without a word, he turned to Esther and said, "Please, 1 plate of jollof rice, add meat." Esther quickly served him, handing over the plate. The man took it, but glanced at Papa J one last time, a strange look in his eyes. Without another word, he entered the car and drove off. Esther stood there for a moment, confused. Who was this man? Why had he seemed so captivated by Papa J? And why had he left so abruptly? The next morning, Esther awoke with a heavy heart. She swept in front of her shop and prepared the food as usual, but today something felt different. Papa J had not come the day before, and for some reason she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She glanced down the road every few minutes, hoping to see him slowly pushing his wheelchair toward her stall. But the day passed, and still no sign of him. She asked Mama Titi if she had seen him, but the woman only laughed and waved it off. "That old man, maybe he went to another street," she said dismissively, but Esther couldn't shake the growing fear in her chest. Where was Papa J? Why hadn't he come? The day stretched on with no sign of him. By evening, Esther's worry had turned to dread. She sat in her small room behind the stall, staring at the plate she had given him the day before, the plate she would never forget. The smell of the jollof rice seemed to linger in the air, but she couldn't bring herself to eat. Had something happened to him? Had he been taken? The following morning, the streets of Lagos bustled with the usual chaotic energy. But Esther felt a deep emptiness in her chest, the kind of unease that settled into her bones and refused to leave. Papa J was still missing. She walked around her small food stall, trying to ignore the growing sense of panic. She hadn't seen him for 2 days now, and with every passing hour, her anxiety grew. She asked the vendors around her, the schoolboys, the tricycle drivers, but no one had seen the old man in the wheelchair. The world seemed to be moving as usual, yet Esther's world had come to a halt. Every corner she turned, she kept hoping to see his frail form, slowly pushing his worn-out chair, but there was nothing. She tried to shake it off. It had been a few days. Perhaps he had just gone somewhere else. But deep down, Esther knew something was wrong. She couldn't explain it, but her heart told her this wasn't a mere absence. Something had happened to Papa J. As the day wore on, the heat of the afternoon sun grew unbearable, and the usual crowds of people flocked to Esther's stall, eager to buy her hot food. She went about her usual tasks, serving rice, beans, and yam porridge, but her mind was elsewhere. She found herself distracted, glancing around every now and then, still hoping to see Papa J. It wasn't like him to disappear, not even a single word, not even a sign that he was still alive. What if something terrible had happened to him? The hours dragged on slowly. Every time a car passed, Esther's heart skipped a beat, thinking it might be a sign of Papa J returning. She even found herself looking up at the sky, praying silently, hoping that wherever he was safe. But as the evening approached, she couldn't hold back her worry any longer. She decided to leave her stall and search for him herself. She locked up her shop and made her way through the busy streets of Lagos, asking everyone she passed if they had seen an old man in a wheelchair. Most of the people just shook their heads or gave her blank stares. "That man, he's probably gone somewhere else," one man said, not even bothering to look up from his phone. "He doesn't stay in one place long." Esther didn't buy it. She knew Papa J. He was stubborn, yes, but he always returned to her stall. It was the only place he could count on, where he could find warmth, food, and maybe even a little kindness. She walked down narrow alleys, past street vendors selling fruits and snacks, past the noisy traffic and the honking horns. She asked everyone she could, hoping for some sign, but no one seemed to know anything. As she turned a corner, she felt a pang of desperation. But then something caught her eye. A black car, parked in front of a hotel just down the street. The same black car she had seen the day before. The same one that had stopped in front of her stall. The one with the man who had stared at Papa J so intently. Esther approached the car cautiously, but before she could get any closer, a man stepped out of the hotel. He was tall, dressed in a black suit, and wearing sunglasses despite the fading sunlight. He looked directly at her, his gaze cold, but his presence commanded attention. Esther didn't know why, but she felt a sudden chill run down her spine. The man walked toward her, and before she could say anything, he handed her a thick brown envelope. "This is for you," he said in a voice that was as emotionless as his face. Without another word, he turned and walked back into the hotel, leaving Esther standing there, staring at the envelope in her hand. What was going on? Why had this man given her the envelope? And what was inside? Her mind raced with questions. She hesitated for a moment before opening it. Inside, she found a single sheet of paper with a few words written in elegant handwriting. "Come to Green Hill Hotel by 4:00 p.m. Don't tell anyone. From a friend." The note was cryptic. From a friend? Esther didn't know who would send such a message or why, but there was something about it that made her uneasy. Yet, at the same time, there was a strange pull, as if she had no choice but to follow this mysterious instruction. She folded the note back into the envelope and stuffed it into her pocket. Green Hill Hotel, she muttered to herself. I've never even been to a hotel before. But there was no turning back now. Esther knew she had to go. She had to find out what this was all about. At precisely 3:30 p.m., Esther locked her food stall and took a deep breath before stepping out onto the street. She felt a nervous flutter in her stomach as she walked toward the tricycle station. The afternoon was hot, and her feet ached from the day's work, but she pushed through. As she approached the tricycle driver, she couldn't help but feel like something was pulling her toward a future she hadn't anticipated. Green Hill Hotel, she said to the driver, her voice shaken slightly. The driver didn't ask any questions. He just nodded and began driving. As they made their way through the busy streets of Lagos, Esther couldn't stop thinking about what she had just gotten herself into. Who would send her such a letter? Why her? She had no idea, but she knew it had something to do with Papa J. The trip to the hotel seemed to take forever. Esther's mind raced with questions, but she couldn't come up with any answers. The noise of the city faded as they left the main road and entered a quieter, more affluent part of Lagos. The buildings were newer, their glass walls shining in the sunlight. The street was cleaner, and the air smelled different, fresher, almost sterile. Eventually, the tricycle stopped in front of a large building, and the driver turned to Esther. "This is Green Hill Hotel," he said, giving her a questioning look. Esther didn't answer. She just nodded, paid him, and stepped out onto the sidewalk. She stared up at the massive building in front of her, its glass windows glinting in the light. The entrance was grand, with polished marble floors and a set of double doors that gleamed with gold handles. 2 security guards stood by the entrance wearing dark glasses, their eyes scanning the area as people passed by. As soon as Esther approached, one of the guards stepped forward. "Good afternoon, madam," he said. I got a letter," Esther said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It says I'm supposed to be here." She handed him the envelope. The guard examined it for a moment, then nodded. "You're expected. Please, go in." Esther's heart skipped a beat. She felt like she was in a dream. She walked inside, her legs trembling as she made her way through the lobby. The interior was sleek and modern, with shiny floors and elegant chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. Everything about this place screamed wealth, and Esther felt out of place in her worn dress and slippers. A man in a black suit appeared from behind a door and beckoned for her to follow him. Without saying a word, he led her through a long hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The walls were lined with expensive artwork, and the floor was so clean that Esther's footsteps seemed to be swallowed by the plush carpet. Finally, they stopped in front of a tall brown door. The man turned to her and said, "Someone is waiting for you inside." Esther's breath caught in her throat. She had no idea who it was or why they had called for her, but the weight of the situation was pressing on her chest. She looked at the door, then back at the man. "Can I go in?" she asked, her voice barely audible. The man nodded. "Yes, you're safe now." Esther stood still for a moment, gathering the courage to open the door. Her heart raced as she reached for the handle, then pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit, and Esther's eyes immediately went to the figure sitting in the middle of the room. It was Papa J, but this wasn't the same man who had sat by her food stall every day. This man looked polished, fresh, and well-dressed, his wheelchair gleaming in the soft light. He was wearing a crisp white shirt with gold buttons, and his face was clean-shaven, his hair combed neatly. Esther froze, her mouth hanging open in shock. "Papa J?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The man in the wheelchair smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "Yes, Esther." he said softly. It's me. Esther's heart raced as she stood frozen in the doorway, her breath shallow and erratic. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. The man in the wheelchair before her was unmistakably Papa J, but there was something entirely different about him. Gone was the frail, disheveled figure she had known for months. In his place sat a well-groomed, polished man whose presence radiated power and confidence. His hair was neatly combed, his shirt crisp and white, with gold buttons that shimmered under the soft light of the room. He no longer looked like a beggar, but a man of wealth and stature. "Papa J?" she asked again, her voice barely a whisper. She stepped into the room, her legs unsteady beneath her, the door clicking softly behind her. The man in the wheelchair smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yes, Esther," he said, his voice soft but authoritative. "It's me." Esther's mind raced. She had fed him every day for months, shared stories, and shared her heart with him. How could this be the same man? What had happened? Why had he hidden himself from her for so long? But how?" she stammered, her hands trembling. The man chuckled softly, his gaze never leaving hers. "I know this is a shock," he said gently, "but I've been watching you for a long time. I wanted to see if your kindness was real, if it was truly unconditional." Esther felt a lump form in her throat. She had always believed in helping others, especially those in need, but never had she imagined that the person she'd been helping was someone so important, someone so different from what she had assumed. The room around her seemed a blur as she tried to process what was happening. How could she have been so blind? How could she have missed the signs? She had thought he was just a poor, crippled beggar, someone abandoned by the world, someone who needed her help. But Papa J, or rather Chief George as he'd now revealed himself to be, was no ordinary man. He was a billionaire, a man with power, with wealth, with influence. Esther's knees buckled slightly, and she sat down on the edge of the chair next to her. "A billionaire," she whispered, trying to make sense of it all. Why would you pretend to be like that? Why would you pretend to be poor?" Chief George leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. "I had my reasons," he said slowly. "I wanted to see the heart of the people around me, to see who would help, not because they thought I could give them something, but because it was the right thing to do." His gaze softened. "I wanted to find someone who would help without expecting anything in return, someone who would give of themselves even when they had nothing." Esther's mind reeled, her thoughts colliding with the revelation. He had watched her, observed her for months, and all this time she had no idea. She had just seen a man in need, a man she could help, and she had given him what little she had. But to think that her actions had been so carefully scrutinized, that the food she gave him every day had been more than just food, it had been a test. "I didn't help you because I wanted anything from you," Esther said, her voice shaky but firm. "I helped you because you were hungry, because you needed help, and I couldn't just turn you away." Chief George nodded slowly. "That's why you're here, Esther. You passed the test. You didn't give because you thought there would be a reward. You gave because you saw a person in need. And that's what I wanted to see." Esther's mind was still trying to catch up with everything that had just been revealed. A billionaire, a man with everything. And yet, he had chosen to live as a beggar, to sit in a wheelchair day after day, to pretend to be poor. It didn't make sense. "But why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you let me know who you were?" He smiled again, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "Because I wanted to see if you would still help me, if you would still be kind to me, even if you knew who I truly was, and you did." Esther felt her chest tighten. "I didn't help you because of who you were," she said softly. "I helped you because you were someone who needed help, just like anyone else." Chief George's eyes softened, and for the first time, Esther saw genuine warmth in his gaze. "That's why I've chosen you, Esther. You have something that very few people have these days, a heart that gives without expecting anything in return. You've shown me that kindness is still alive, and for that, I want to help you." Esther's heart skipped a beat. "Help me?" she repeated, still trying to process his words. "How?" Chief George reached into his pocket and pulled out a small set of keys, his fingers brushing against the smooth metal before he extended them toward her. "I want to help you build something that reflects your heart," he said quietly. "Something that will allow you to give back to the community. A place where you can feed people, not just out of charity, but out of a desire to make the world a better place." Esther stared at the keys in his hand, her mouth dry. What are these for?" she asked, her voice trembling. "These are the keys to your new restaurant," Chief George said. "You're going to run it. You'll have everything you need to make it a success, and with it, you'll be able to feed more people, to give more of yourself to the world." Esther's hands shook as she took the keys from him. Her mind was still spinning, trying to comprehend the enormity of what was happening. She had been helping this man, this billionaire, not knowing who he truly was, and now he was offering her the chance to run a restaurant, a dream she had never even dared to imagine. This is too much," Esther said softly, shaking her head in disbelief. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Chief George replied gently. "Your actions have already spoken for you." Esther's mind raced. She had gone from struggling to survive, from running a small food stall by the side of the road, to being offered the opportunity of a lifetime. She had dreamed of one day having a place of her own, a place where she could feed people in need, but she never imagined it would happen like this. "You can't be serious," she whispered, her eyes welling up with tears. "This is too much. I don't deserve this." Chief George smiled again, his eyes kind and understanding. "You deserve it more than anyone, Esther. Your heart is pure, and that's something money can't buy. You've given without expecting anything in return, and now it's time for you to receive. You've earned this." Esther was silent for a long moment, her hands still trembling as she clutched the keys in her palm. This was more than she had ever dreamed of, more than she could have ever hoped for. But even with all this wealth, all this opportunity, Esther knew one thing for sure: she would never forget where she came from. "I won't forget," she said softly, her voice full of conviction. "I'll remember every person I've helped, every meal I've served. I'll remember where I started, and I'll make sure I keep giving back." Chief George nodded, his smile widening. "I know you will, Esther, and that's why I've chosen you, because I know your heart, and I know you'll make a difference." With that, he gestured for her to stand. "Come on, let me show you something," he said, his voice full of warmth. Esther stood, still holding the keys tightly in her hand. "Where are we going?" she asked. Chief George didn't answer right away. Instead, he led her to the door of the room and opened it. As they stepped into the hallway, Esther's eyes widened at the sight before her. In front of her were 5 large black SUVs. all lined up in the parking lot, their polished exteriors gleaming in the sunlight. Bodyguards stood next to each vehicle, their eyes scanning the area with precision. "Where are we going?" Esther asked again, her voice full of awe. "We're going to your new restaurant," Chief George replied, his eyes twinkling with pride. Esther stood there for a moment, stunned. She had gone from working at a small stall on the side of the road to standing in front of a fleet of cars ready to take her to a place she never thought possible. As she climbed into the first SUV, she looked back at Chief George, who was smiling at her, a look of pride and kindness in his eyes. As the convoy of SUs moved through the streets of Lagos, Esther's mind raced. She had no idea where this journey would take her, but one thing was certain: her life would never be the same again. And as the cars made their way through the city, Esther couldn't help but feel a sense of hope for the future. A future she never thought she would have, but one that was now within her grasp. Esther couldn't remember the last time she had felt so alive. The SUV glided through the busy streets of Lagos, but her mind wasn't on the city around her. Her thoughts raced with the realization of the overwhelming change that had taken place in her life. Just a few days ago, she had been standing at her small roadside food stall, serving meals to those in need, struggling to get by. Now, she was sitting in the back of a luxury vehicle, heading toward her very own restaurant. The realization made her feel both excited and terrified. Her heart raced as the convoy of SUVs turned onto a quieter street, lined with trees and modern buildings. The further they drove, the more surreal everything felt. Was this truly happening? Was she really on her way to the restaurant that Chief George had promised her? The convoy slowed as they pulled into a large parking lot. Esther's eyes widened when she saw the building in front of her. It was nothing like the small shop she had run in the past. The restaurant was a multi-story structure with sleek glass walls, tall and imposing, standing proudly against the sky. The exterior gleamed in the sunlight, and the building had an air of elegance that took her breath away. "Is this really it?" she whispered, half to herself. Chief George, who had been sitting across from her in the SUV, smiled and nodded. "This is yours, Esther," he said. "This is the place where your new journey begins." As they stepped out of the vehicle, a few staff members, all wearing crisp uniforms, greeted them. One of the men opened the door to the restaurant and motioned for them to enter. The interior was just as impressive as the exterior. The floors were polished marble, and the soft lighting created a warm, welcoming ambiance. Esther's eyes couldn't take in all the beauty around her. There were large chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, casting a gentle glow over the elegant furniture and exquisite decorations. This wasn't just a restaurant. It was a statement. It was something that people would travel from far and wide to experience. "This is beyond anything I could have ever imagined," Esther said, her voice full of awe. She had dreamt of having her own restaurant, but she had never pictured it like this. This place was more than just a dream. It was a testament to everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed. Chief George smiled, his expression kind but knowing. "You've earned it, Esther. Your kindness, your generosity, it all led you here." As they walked further into the restaurant, Esther couldn't help but notice the high-end equipment in the kitchen, the gleaming appliances, the beautifully arranged tables set for the grand opening. Everything was perfect. A few chefs were already inside, busy preparing for the day's tasks. Esther glanced around, her heart swelling with pride. "How did all of this happen so fast?" she asked. "Just a week ago, I was working at my small stall, and now this. It's all because of you, Esther," Chief George said, his voice steady and warm. "You showed me what true kindness looked like. I wanted to reward that. I wanted to give you a place where you could truly make a difference." Esther felt tears welling in her eyes as she looked around. She had always believed in kindness, in helping others no matter the circumstances, but she had never expected anything in return. Now, she was standing in the very manifestation of that belief. She was no longer just a woman serving food at a small roadside stall. She was someone who could change lives. Chief George led her to the back of the restaurant where a private office awaited her. The door opened to reveal a spacious room decorated with tastefully chosen furniture. A large desk sat against one wall, and behind it was a window that overlooked the entire city. "This is your office," Chief George said. "Everything you need will be here. You'll make the decisions, you'll lead this place, and you'll bring your vision to life." Esther stood in the doorway, still trying to wrap her mind around everything. This wasn't just a new chapter in her life. This was a completely new story. It was a story she had never imagined for herself. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted, her voice quiet. "This is so much bigger than anything I've ever imagined." Chief George stepped forward, his eyes filled with warmth and reassurance. "I believe in you, Esther. You've already proven you have what it takes. You've already shown the world your heart. Now, it's time to show them what you can do." Esther took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. For the first time in her life, she realized that the world wasn't just about survival. It wasn't just about getting by and hoping for better days. It was about making the most of what you had, about using your gifts to help others, about leaving a legacy of kindness and compassion. As Esther looked out the window, she could see the bustling streets of Lagos below. This city, which had once seemed so overwhelming and impersonal, now felt like a place where she could truly make a difference. She had started with nothing. Now she had everything. But it wasn't just about the money, the restaurant, or the fame that might come with it. It was about the opportunity to change lives. It was about the chance to give back, to help people in ways she had never been able to before. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice full of conviction. "I'll run this place. I'll make it something special." Chief George smiled, his expression proud. "I knew you would." As the days passed, Esther threw herself into her new role. She spent long hours in the restaurant, overseeing every detail from the menu to the decor. She wanted everything to reflect her heart, her values. She wanted this place to be a sanctuary for those in need, a place where people could come, not just for good food, but for a sense of belonging. The restaurant quickly became known throughout Lagos, drawing in crowds from all over the city. People came not only for the delicious meals, but for the atmosphere. Esther had created a place where kindness was a priority, where people were treated with respect no matter who they were. As the restaurant flourished, so did Esther's confidence. She realized that she was more than capable of leading this venture. She had the strength, the heart, and the drive to make it a success. But even as the business grew, she never lost sight of the values that had brought her here. She continued to give back to the community, helping those who had no place to turn, offering free meals to the homeless, and supporting local charities. Esther knew that she had been given this opportunity not for her own benefit, but for the benefit of others. She had been given the tools to make a real difference in the world, and she was determined to use them. One evening, as she stood in the restaurant, watching the guests enjoy their meals, Esther felt a sense of peace she had never known before. This wasn't just a success story. This was a journey of transformation. From the small, humble stall by the side of the road to the grand restaurant she now ran, Esther had come full circle. And, in the process, she had changed the lives of countless others. She was no longer just a woman struggling to survive. She was a beacon of hope for those in need, a symbol of what kindness and generosity could bring. Her life had changed forever, and now she was ready to help others change theirs. As Esther looked around the bustling restaurant, she knew her journey was far from over. This was just the beginning, and she couldn't wait to see where it would take her.